All right, so I have 6 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started tonight. Wanted to welcome everybody to this evening's Ag in the Evening presentation. I think most of you know me, but in case somebody doesn't, my name is Dr. Jason Banta. I'm the Extension Beef Cattle Specialist stationed at our Overton station in East Texas. And tonight's Ag in the Evening topic will be needle and syringe selection. So we'll talk about some of the differences out there and why we may want to use one versus another. We'll talk about some cleaning options for our multiple use or repeating syringes. And then we'll talk about a few things in regards to giving injections. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. We'll start off with needles. And when I think about needle selection, there's going to be several different things we're going to think about. So that's going to include needle gauge, needle length, needle hub will be the three big ones. When we think about needle gauge, we're talking about how big in diameter is that needle. So if you look on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see an 18 gauge needle and a 16 gauge needle, and you can see the diameter of that 16 gauge needle is going to be a little bit bigger than the 18 gauge needle. Good way to kind of think of this is if you're familiar with electrical wire, we follow the same thing. As the number gets bigger, the gauge or the diameter of that needle is going to get smaller. That's the same way wire is numbered. Um, the two most common sizes we'll use most often in beef cattle production will be either an 18 gauge needle or a 16 gauge needle. And that really comes down to viscosity of the product. So if we're just given vaccines or if we're given something that's pretty thin, either a 16 or 18 gauge needle will work well. If we're given something that's pretty thick, say penicillin or oxytetracycline, or some of the dewormers, then a 16 gauge needle will work much better in that situation. The other place gauge may come into play for you is if you're filling a multiple dose syringe where you're trying to fill a 50 cc barrel of that syringe. You can fill that a whole lot quicker with the 16 gauge needle than you can with an 18 gauge needle. While giving the vaccine itself, either 18 or 16 works fine. You may lean towards a 16 just from the standpoint of filling that syringe. The other needle gauge you see I have up there in the left-hand picture is a 20 gauge needle. And I'm going to tell you that's going to be one from an injection standpoint we really probably want to avoid in most situations. With those 20 gauge needles, it's just too easy to bend those needles. They bend much easier than a 16 or 18 gauge needle. So in most situations, that's not going to be a needle gauge I'm going to be looking at for giving injections. We're going to really focus on those 16 or 18 gauge needles. When it comes to length, there are some other options out there, but the four most common lengths that are readily available would be a 5/8, a 3/4, an inch, and an inch and a half. And if we're given sub-Q injections, so giving that injection under the skin, really the shorter the needle that works better. So I want to use a 5/8 or 3/4, and really my preference is going to be a 5/8 in that situation. If you're given an intermuscular injection, I'm going to tell you an inch is plenty. Even on a big 22, 2,300 pound bull, an inch is plenty for that intermuscular injection. The thing with that inch and a half needle is it just becomes a little more cumbersome, and it's also much more likely to bend when we're given an intermuscular injection. I really don't have any place when I'm giving injections for an inch and a half. You may hear some people talk about with some ester synchronization products that you want to get those real deep in the muscle. There's actually not any data that I can find that supports that. And if you look at some of the newer ester synchronization products, they're actually labeled for sub-Q use. So an inch is plenty for those intramuscular injections. The other thing is, anytime we have the option between a sub-Q or an intramuscular injection, we always want to go with sub-Q from a BQA standpoint. There are a few products out there, though, that are only labeled for intramuscular use, and so that's when we would think about using that 1 inch needle in that situation. The other thing some people wonder about or ask about is the bevel. And when we talk about the bevel of the needle, that's the opening on the end of the needle and specifically the shape of that opening. And with What's commonly available for livestock use would either be a B bevel, an intermediate bevel, or an A bevel. And really, it's going to be dictated by the length of the needle you're purchasing. So if you're purchasing 5/8, those are typically going to be a B bevel. If you're purchasing a 3/4, so that bottom left-hand picture there, that would be what's called an intermediate bevel. And then if you're purchasing an inch or an inch and a half, that's going to be an A bevel there. And you can get the bevels regardless of what gauge you're looking at, but it's really going to be related to length there. The ones we're going to use most often are going to be that 5/8 B bevel there on the top left for giving sub-Q injections. And then if we are going intermuscular, that A bevel will slide into the muscle just a little bit easier in that situation. So that may be something else you see when you're looking at needles. The hub is another consideration. And so the two most common hubs we'll see will be like the one on the top here. That would be an aluminum hub versus a plastic hub. The aluminum hub needles are slightly more expensive than the plastic hubs. But really, when we think about BQA and making sure we don't break a needle and get in a situation where we're trying to remove a needle from an animal, we really want to look at those aluminum hub needles. Especially if you're using a multiple dose syringe, and we'll talk about those later, definitely need an aluminum hub in that situation. But did want to make you aware of, you'll see both of them there, but that aluminum hub is going to be a better choice. The other thing you'll see from time to time, and this is not a setup I would want to use generally from an injection standpoint, but you can purchase a prepackaged 3cc syringe that already has a needle on it. And these can come in handy in certain situations. The place I really like them is if you're pulling blood out of a tail vessel for pregnancy determination in cattle, that prepackaged 3cc syringe with a needle on it works really well in that situation. But what you will see when you're pulling that blood is how easy it is to bend that 20 gauge needle. And so that just shows you why typically we don't want to use that to be given injections and going through that thicker hide compared to where the hide's really thin back there on the underside of the tail where we're pulling that blood. This one I've already is the picture, the package has been removed, but what you'll see is they'll come in a package and a cap on that needle, but you can buy those prepackaged there. Some people in certain situations, if they're really concerned about a disease in the herd that can be transmitted through the injection process, sometimes you'll see these prepackaged 3cc syringes with the 20 gauge needles used in those circumstances. That's okay if you're only using one syringe needle combination per animal. Don't be trying to use this plastic hub needle that's a 20 gauge to be given more than one injection in that situation. Like them for drawing blood, don't really like them for giving vaccine, but we will see that be used at times in the industry. Some other needles that you may see if you're looking through a pharmaceutical supply catalog or something like that is these needles here, which are actually designed so they can be detected by a metal detection device. One thing that's kind of interesting is if you look, it'll say single use, but then autoclavable. Well, those two things don't go together. If it's a single use needle, we're not going to be autoclaving it in that situation. These cost quite a bit more. I don't think they're necessary in most operations. But if you had a reason you wanted to use those, just wanted to make you aware that they're out there and why they may be a little bit different than the typical needles you see. The big thing is when we think about from a BQA standpoint, it's not about trying to detect a needle that's in the carcass. It's about making sure we prevent that needle from ever entering the carcass. And if we do have a needle that is in the animal, we make sure that animal never goes into the food supply chain in that situation. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Needles. We'll go ahead and spend a few minutes here talking about syringes. And when we think about syringes, there's a lot of different options. We'll talk about these plastic disposable syringes, and there's a lot of different sizes ranging from a 1 cc up to you can get 140 cc. On the screen here, I have a 3 cc, a 12 cc, a 20, a 35, and a 60 cc. So what would be kind of handy to have on an operation? And I'll tell you, I think it's in a lot of situations having some 60 cc syringes is handy. Not going to be using these for giving multiple doses of vaccine, but if we're treating a cow for foot rot and we're using something like oxytetracycline, depending on what strength of oxytetracycline we're using, it's either going to be 3 cc's or 4.5 cc's per 100 pounds of body weight. The 4.5 is going to be most common. So if it's 4.5 cc's per 100 pounds of body weight, and we're going to be treating 1,000-pound cow just to keep the math simple, you're talking about 45 cc's of that antibiotic you need to deliver to that cow. And so that's where that big 60 cc syringe comes in, is you can pull all that up in one syringe. Now, you're not going to give it all in one location. The general rule of thumb is no more than 10 cc's in one location unless the label says differently. And so if we're giving 45 in this situation, we would want to give that in 5 different places on the neck of that animal. Since we're given the same product, we can put one product or one injection and then another one below it. If I was given vaccine, I wouldn't want to put one vaccine and then another vaccine below it because I don't want them running together potentially there. So that's something to think about. But that's where those 60 cc syringes would come in handy. Um, I'd also like to have a few maybe 12 cc syringes on hand, or even some 6 cc syringes on hand if I needed to be given small doses of something. But a lot of variation there. You can decide what works for your operation and then just keep some of those on hand as you need it. The other thing I want to point out while we're looking at these syringes is you may be looking at the ends and noticing the ends a little different. So this end for the 3 cc, for the 35 cc, and for the 60 cc are all the same. That's what we would call a luer slip, meaning the needle just slips right on the end of the syringe there. If we look at the 12 cc or the 20 cc, that's what we would call a luer lock end. And so the needle actually twists on there. So it's a little more secure. Um, and so that's just something to be mindful of. Sometimes you don't have an option there. If you do have an option, I kind of like those luer lock a little bit better just because that needle stays a little more secure in that situation. If you're going to be vaccinating a lot of animals, you may want to consider investing in what we would call a repeating syringe or a multi-dose syringe. So here's some examples on the screen. So if we look at the one on the far left here, this is a 25 cc barrel. The one in the middle is from the same company, but it's a 50 cc barrel. When we look at the adjustments on these, so the one with the 25 cc barrel will adjust from a half to 1 to 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 cc's. So if you're given a 2 cc Clostridial vaccine, you could set that on 2 cc's, and every time you squeeze that handle, it gives the exact same amount to that animal. If you're doing a 5 cc, then that 50 cc barrel comes in more handy because it'll adjust from 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cc's. Now you may say, well, I could get the 50 cc barrel and set it on 2 and give a 2 cc injection. And you can. The challenge with that is when you think about if you have it set on 5 and you squeeze it, you have a full squeeze or a full trigger pull there. When you set it on 2, it's much shorter, and sometimes you're a little unsure if you actually have given that injection or not. So when I'm deciding which barrel size I want to use, I'm going to base it off the amount of vaccine I need to give. So if I'm giving a 2 cc dose of vaccine, I'm going to use a 25 cc barrel. If I'm using a 5 cc vaccine, I'm going to use a 50 cc barrel. The other thing that comes in handy there is if we're using a 25 cc syringe and it'll hold, uh, and we're doing 2 cc's, then it'll hold just over 12 doses there. The 50 cc barrel, if we're doing 5 cc's, would hold 10 doses. So we're looking at 10 to 12 doses if we match those up to the volume of product we're given there. That works out really well when we think about changing needles. So I hadn't talked about it yet, but we always want to change needles if that needle gets dull, if it gets dirty, if it gets bent. If it gets bent, definitely don't try to straighten it out, get you another one. The other thing is we never want to go back into the bottle with a dirty needle. And so, and if the needle hasn't gotten dull, hasn't gotten dirty, then the rule of thumb is to change it every 10 to 12 head. So it works real well when we need to refill these multi-dose syringes, just to go ahead and change the needle at that point in time, go in the bottle with a clean needle, and then we're ready to vaccinate the next 10 to 12 head, assuming that needle doesn't get dull or dirty and we don't need to change it before we go back in the bottle. So it matches up real well and makes that process a little smoother for us, and we're not having to change needles as frequently there. The one on the right is a different brand. Again, it'll come in a 25 or a 50 cc barrel, and it has similar adjustments. One thing I will point out to you is if you look on the end, the way you refill these is this one has a little button you push down, and then you grab this black knob, or it could be a different colored knob depending on what version you bought, and you pull it back and you use that to refill it. And then once you get it full, you squeeze it, and then it'll gauge it. And then every time after that, you squeeze it to give the same dose. I will tell you, I had a gentleman one day, I had these out on the table and he was looking at them, and he made the comment that for him, he had some arthritis in his hands, and he felt like this design with the green handle and the white plunger may be a little easier for him to pull back versus this design. So that may be something, if that's a concern for you, to look at when you're getting ready to purchase these. I will tell you there's several different brands out there, and they range in quality quite a bit. We'll look at some other brands here in a minute. I actually priced several different brands last week, and they kind of range from about $31 to $102. This particular slide will kind of be in that $75 to $80 range, depending on where you buy them. And think, well, that's not cheap, and it's not. But if you take care of these, they will last you a lifetime. The other thing I will tell you is if you've never used them before, once you use them the first time, you'll be wishing you had purchased them long ago, because it does make vaccinating animals much easier. One thing to be aware of with these is they do have an O-ring, and there's two different styles. So this particular brand, that plunger in the inside of the barrel, on the end of it, it has a groove that this O-ring will set in. Some other brands, the O-ring will be much more filled in with just a very tiny hole in the middle that you actually have to tighten. There's a place on that plunger that you pull back, you can actually tighten the two little plates on each side of that O-ring to tighten it down. So that's something to be aware of. What I've found is the ones that you have to tighten down, sometimes we have more issues with those leaking compared to this style. The other thing is sometimes people worry about, well, will that O-ring wear out over time and do I have to replace it? It is a good idea just to have a spare O-ring or two on hand. I will tell you though, if you maintain these syringes well and use the system I'm going to talk about cleaning later, I've never had to change the O-rings on the set that I use for personal use for giving vaccines. Now, the set that I haul around in the pickup that we use for demos, and not actually giving the vaccine, but just showing people and letting them play, I have had some of those O-rings split, but we'll kind of talk about those differences here in a minute. As far as lubricating that O-ring, I don't want to lubricate it with any kind of mineral oil or vegetable oil. I don't want anything really left in that barrel that could potentially reduce the efficacy of whatever vaccine product I'm using. So I either want to just use some distilled water that's left after the cleaning process or that first draw of the vaccine to lubricate my O-ring there. So here's some other styles of those repeating syringes. So just a little bit of a different grip on the handle here. This is a true test version, if I remember right. This is a Hapner here on the top left. It's going to be one of the more expensive versions on the market. This is an Ideal Instruments. It actually has the O-ring you have to compress. So the plunger here, you actually can turn that on the back there and that will compress that O-ring. If you don't get that done exactly right, you can have some leakages in those situations, so be aware of that. The other thing with this Ideal and this Hapner is the adjustment's a little bit different. So you can see this one has a turning wheel like the two on the previous slide did. These actually have 5 little grooves and you kind of have a little pin that you move into whatever groove. So kind of comes down to personal preference as far as which one you want to go with. This is another multiple-dose syringe, but it's designed a little bit different. So it's actually designed for the bottle to stay attached to the syringe. Some people like these, some people don't. For me, it's a little more cumbersome to move in and out and around the chute. And also, when we think about keeping this cool, you have to set this version in an ice chest between each animal, which we'll look at some options for the barrel syringes that I think are a little more manageable for most people. But again, personal preference. This is just a different style of, well, the other thing I should mention on this previous one is you do have to be mindful of some of them that the barrel or the bottle attaches to, I should say, is don't have any kind of adjustment. So make sure you buy the dosing volume that you need. And also it only fits certain size bottles. So let's say you had to work 70 head of calves, and so you bought one 50-dose bottle of Clostridial vaccine in two 10-dose bottles. Well, the 10-dose bottles are probably going to fit on here, but that 50-dose bottle won't. And so that's something to keep in mind with this style versus the barrel style. This is another version where the bottle attaches, so just to see, and some of these do have some adjustments on them. This one does, but a lot of them don't, so just be aware of that. When we're giving vaccines, we never want to use any kind of syringes with this tubing on there. It's just because we can't protect that from temperature and sunlight. And sunlight is actually really hard on our vaccines. So these work great if we're given an injectable dewormer or given an injectable vaccine, or excuse me, an injectable vitamin or something like that. But these are not designed to be used with their vaccine products. So when we're thinking about syringe selection, one of the things we think about is making sure we protect that vaccine. And so we always talk about protecting the vaccine when we pick it up and when we have it at the house before we're using it. But it's also very important to protect the vaccine chute side before we use it, and then also while it's setting in that syringe. Because if you have 10 doses in that multiple dose syringe, you may be rolling along pretty good, but then something happens, and so you're delayed for several minutes. You don't want that syringe with that vaccine just sitting on a table or something out there chute side. We want to make sure we keep it cool between every animal and use. And so you can see the middle picture on the bottom here is one that Dr. Ron Gill actually made. Is just an ice chest he took and drilled some holes in the side of it so he could slide those multiple dose syringes in. And that's what we used for a lot of years. And then several years ago, some companies started making various versions of these with some of the real fancy ice chests that'll hold ice for a long time. These can range from $200 to $500, depending on which version and which brand you buy. There's some few differences to be aware of if you are looking at some of these. So with the one on the top right hand here is the syringes. Actually, there's a groove they set in at an angle on the side, and then we could keep ice or cold packs in here, and you could also keep some vaccine in here. If we look at this one, they're coming in from the top. Some people like coming in from the top, some people like coming in from the side. That's personal preference. One thing to be mindful of is make sure we can keep some cold packs near where those syringes are at. And I bring that up because I was at a trade show one day years ago, and I was looking at one of these, and I probably had a bit of a puzzled look on my face because the salesperson asked me, "Is like, what are you trying to figure out there?" And I said, "Well, where do you put your cold packs?" And then the salesperson got a puzzled look on their face. And as we got to talking, what we realized was is that particular company was made up north, and up there they're trying to make sure that vaccine doesn't freeze on them at certain times of the year. And so the container where the multi-dose syringes were sliding in didn't have a place to put anything because they weren't worried about trying to keep it cold. They were worried about trying to keep it from freezing. And I pointed out for us, we're worried about keeping it cool. And so I need a place to put some cold packs there. So that's something to be mindful of if you are looking at one of these designs. You can also make a setup for yourself. So this is just a regular ice chest. You can go buy pretty much anywhere. I just took an 1.5 inch drill bit and drilled some holes in the lid. I like going in from the top versus the side. It's just a little easier for me when we're working cattle. I will only drill enough holes for however many syringes you're going to be using. This is my demo model, so I put 4 in there, but for the one we use, typically we'll only put 2 or maybe 3. And then just get you an 1.5 inch by 6 inch, what they call sink tailpiece. This is the drain pipe underneath your kitchen sink. You can slide that in the hole, and then it works perfect to drop those syringes in that situation. Do be mindful of that the drain pipe that goes under bathroom sink is 1.25 inches. So that's a little too small. So you do want the 1.5 by 6 inch sink tailpiece, and that works great. And then what we do is we'll take a little stool and set that ice chest on. And that's just so who's ever having vaccinating doesn't have to bend over quite as far when they get ready to drop that syringe in the holder between animals. I will tell you in this situation, when I'm dropping straight down like that, I personally do not recap my needles between each animal. But that's assuming you're not going to be hitting that ice chest or the side of the holder and you can drop it straight down. If you do have a tendency to hit something, then I would recap that needle between each animal. If you don't, it's a little easier to drop it down. So you can reach in there, grab it, reach over, give the vaccine, drop it down. Just simplifies things for you and takes one step out of the equation. The other thing is if you're only working a few cattle, then you may be using some of these disposable plastic syringes to give vaccine, but we do need to label them to make sure we don't get them mixed up. So whether you take colored tape or you take a colored marker and make a mark along that plunger and then make that same mark on the bottle, just something so you don't get those mixed up. On the multi-dose syringes, one brand actually has different colored balls that you can screw on to the end of the plunger. I'll actually just take a Sharpie and write on the handle. So one of them will say 8-way on it for my 8-way Clostridial vaccine, and one of them will say viral combination for my viral reproductive combo vaccine in that situation. However you want to do it, it's fine. Just figure out something that works for you. The other thing with these plastic syringes like this is, so let's take this 12 cc syringe here, and let's just say you were using a 2 cc vaccine. Well, theoretically, you could put 6 doses in there. The problem with trying to do that is it's very hard to make sure you give the same amount every time. So if you're using plastic syringes to give vaccine, only draw up 1 dose at a time. That's where those multiple dose syringes are really worth that investment. It'll make it a whole lot easier. Just go ahead and spend a little bit of money and do that rather than trying to use these incorrectly. So the question is, if you do go ahead and purchase these repeating syringes or multiple dose syringes, how do you go about cleaning them? And there's definitely some things we don't want to do. So we don't ever want to use any kind of soap, disinfectant, bleach, Navasan, Lysol, anything like that, because we can have some residue that gets left in the barrel, and that can reduce the efficacy of our vaccine after that. So then what are our options? And there's a range of approaches people will use, from just using tap water, which to me is not sufficient enough, all the way to autoclaving, which most of us aren't going to have access to an autoclave. So I'll tell you the kind of system I've developed and what we use in our operation, and seems to work well. What I do is when we get done working, I'll just take and use tap water and rinse off the outside of the syringe. So any dirt or anything, I'll just rinse everything off the outside. After that, I'll get me a glass measuring cup. Don't get the one out of the kitchen. You're going to want to purchase one and have it dedicated for this just for this purpose. But I'll get me a glass measuring cup and I'll fill it with distilled water. And I use distilled water versus tap water because some of the tap water has quite a bit of mineral in it. Plus, if they've had some kind of leak and they've spiked with a high dose of chlorine, you don't really want that sitting in your bottle if you're going to be using a modified live vaccine there later. So I just get me a gallon jug of distilled water, really cheap. I fill up my glass measuring cup with distilled water. I'll take my metal transfer needle, rinse it real quick, and then drop it in the distilled water there. And I'll take my distilled water in my measuring cup and put it in the microwave until it starts boiling. After that, I'll pull it out, and then I'll just take and draw up that boiling water and flush that syringe out 6 or 8 times. And after I do that, I'll put it in a plastic container till I get ready to use it the next time. Now, I will tell you, I think it's very important, if you do it this way, take and put that plastic container in the freezer, okay? Because there's going to be a little bit of steam residue left in that barrel, and I don't want to just put it up in the cabinet. If you do that, you could get a little mold or mildew doing that. By throwing it in the freezer, you don't have to worry about that. And that little bit of steam that stays in that barrel works perfect to lubricate that O-ring the next time. So we just take them and throw them in that plastic container. The plastic container goes into the freezer till we get ready to work cattle again. Then just remember to pull it out of the freezer about an hour before, because you do need to let it thaw out. Now, the other thing that some of you may be sitting there thinking about is, did I just say that I put a metal needle in the microwave? And yes, I did. The reason I do that is twofold. One, it basically sterilizes my needle for me because I have it in boiling water there. But the more important reason I do it is because when you heat water or coffee or something in the microwave, especially in a container that's really slick, you can have a situation where that liquid will get above boiling temperature but won't actually boil. It won't actually bubble. What happens if that occurs? When you reach in there and grab it and you break the surface tension of that water, it can actually cause that superheated water to explode, which is something you don't want to have happen. And so by putting in that metal needle in there, it breaks the surface tension of the water and forces it to bubble when that temperature gets hot enough, so I don't have to worry about that. I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not a mechanical engineer. I'm a ruminant nutritionist and a beef cattle specialist. So you have to decide if you're comfortable putting that metal needle in the microwave. As long as it's covered in water, never had any issue with that. For the newer microwaves, if you look at them, a lot of them actually have a metal rack in them. So just be aware of that, but that's something you have to decide if you're comfortable doing or not. If you're not comfortable using the transfer needle in there, then what you can do is get you a new toothpick, a wooden toothpick, and just use that every time. And so that's the way we go about cleaning those. What I do with my measuring cup is, the first time after you purchase it, just rinse it really, really, really good with tap water. Don't use any um, kind of soap or anything. And then I'll fill it with distilled water, put it in the microwave, let it boil. And then the very first time after I purchased and washed it, I'll just pour that first deal of boiling water down the sink. After that, I don't ever have to worry about cleaning it because it gets clean when we're boiling water. And once it gets cooled off, I put it back in my plastic container and it goes in the freezer with those syringes. So I only rinse it really good with tap water that first time and then just fill it with distilled water after that. Last thing I would mention here, and I think I said it, but I'll say it again real quick, is just make sure that glass measuring cup, you let it cool off before you put it in the syringes in the freezer. Because if you don't, hot glass in a freezer doesn't tend to work out real well. So let it cool off to room temperature, then you can put everything in the freezer till you get ready to work cattle the next time. So that's a technique I use. Some people want to break those apart and put them in boiling water. You can. If you're going to do that, you need to have a dedicated container that you're going to boil in. Don't take a pot or something that gets used for cooking and boil those syringes in there. So that's why I really like this approach of just getting my boiling water in the measuring cup and just flushing that syringe with the boiling water. All right, so the last thing to spend a little bit of time talking about tonight is giving some injections and just some things to remember and keep in mind there. If we're given a subcutaneous injection, which if we have the option is what we want to do, we want to use what's called a two-handed tented technique. So we grab the hide with one hand, pull it out, we create a little tent that we can go in with that needle to help give that sub-Q injection. In this situation, I either want to go on the top or the side. I don't want to try to come from the bottom because you're more likely to poke yourself in that situation. I'll show you a video here in a minute where the person's pulled it out at a little different angle, making it real easy to go in the side there. Not a right or wrong, just whatever works best for you, but it does work better if you'll use two hands in that situation. So where do we give those injections? If we're given intermuscular, the only place we're going to give that injection in the neck. The reason being is even if we didn't give any product, if we just went into the animal with a needle, we can impact the tenderness of the meat around where that needle went in. And so if we have to give an intermuscular injection by giving it in the neck, we grind all that meat up so we don't have to worry about any kind of tenderness issues in those situations. With a sub-Q injection, we can also give those in the neck. And if we give that sub-Q injection right, even if it leaves a little knot, when the hide gets peeled off that carcass, the knot will go with the hide and there won't be any trace left on the carcass there. So sub-Q or IM, we can go in the neck. If we needed additional location to give an injection, we could go in the elbow pocket down here, but that is going to be a sub-Q injection only. We're not going to give an intermuscular injection down there, sub-Q only. Tend to not use that spot a lot. Typically with the products we're using now with two sides of the neck and spacing those injections at hands width apart, we have enough room. But if you did need to go in the elbow pocket, you could there. Just be mindful is depending on how the chute's set up, it's really easy to get your hand smashed when you're trying to use that elbow pocket location. So that's something to be mindful of there. I mentioned this earlier, but let's say we're giving more than one vaccine. I don't want to give one and then go down a few inches below and give another one. Give one vaccine and then 4 inches or hand's width over, I could give another vaccine. If I needed to give a third, then go over to the other side of the animal and do that. So do make sure you space those apart and be mindful how you're spacing them. This is just showing an injection site lesion. So all this is scar tissue. This is not a food safety issue, but it is a eating experience or food quality issue. And so that's why we never want to give any injections in the hip or anywhere other than the neck when we're giving those intermuscular injections. This was actually a study done at Colorado State where a 5 cc Clostridial vaccine was given when those calves were about 50 days old. They went through a stocker program, they went through a feedlot. They were harvested roughly 400 days later, so over a year later, and you can see that injection site lesion still remains. So that's why it's important we give those injections in the right location. So I have a little video here just to show some technique on giving a sub-Q injection. So just pull that hide out. You can go in and push into the tent there, or some people will take and actually kind of pull the needle, or excuse me, pull the hide over the needle, which is what he did there that second time. Comes down to personal preference. For me, it's a whole lot easier just to tent the skin and go in with the needle rather than trying to pull the hide over the needle. But whatever works best for you. I'll play that back here so you can see that one more time. So just create a spot where we can go sub-Q under the skin and go ahead and give that vaccine. Or if we were given an antibiotic, it would be the same technique there, whatever kind of sub-Q injection we're trying to give. And then you can see he kind of took that skin and grabbed it with his thumb and index finger. It's just good to take and kind of rub that. It helps kind of get those layers to separate and to help prevent a little bit of leakage back out of that hole in that situation. The key anytime we're giving injections is we need to make sure we have those animals properly restrained, because if we don't, they tend to move a little bit more, and that's when we really increase the risk of bending or breaking those needles. This is just showing giving intramuscular injection in the elbow pocket down there. Some people, especially if you're flanking and dragging calves, that elbow pocket may be a little easier to access than some other locations, but the exact same technique there. So what if we needed to give a intramuscular injection rather than a sub-Q? We're just going to go in at a 90-degree angle to the neck. And if we're using an inch-long needle, I would go in either up to the hub or up to about 1/8 of an inch of that hub. I will tell you, when you're giving an intramuscular injection, I wouldn't just go in and give the injection first. What I like doing is taking the backside of my hand and just kind of rubbing it just slightly on where I'm going to give that injection. That just kind of lets that cow know I'm there, and they tend not to jump as much. So if you'll take your hand and just kind of rub it and then give that injection, that tends to work a little bit better rather than just give an injection and the injection being the first point of contact. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Hopefully you found some things that you can use the next time you get ready to work cattle. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute and ask those or put those in the chat box, and I'll be happy to address those. One thing I will mention while you may be typing here is, well, what needles are pretty handy to keep around. I'll typically keep a box of 16 by 5/8 inch needles. So that's for my sub-Q vaccine, which all the vaccine I tend to use is going to be sub-Q. So we'll keep a box of 16 by 5/8. And then I'll just keep a few 16 by 1s or 18 by 1s if I needed to give certain intramuscular injections. If you said, well, I only want to keep one needle around and want to use the same needle for everything, 16 by 1 inch would probably be the most versatile, but I do think it's worth keeping a bunch of those short needles around and then just a handful of the 1 inch needles. So any questions about tonight's topic or any other beef cattle related topic you may have a question on? Okay, so question came in is, when using a multiple dose syringe, do you need to clean the needle between animals? In most situations, we are not going to clean the needle between animals. If you decide there is some need for that because of disease, that's where we may want to use a different needle for each animal. We definitely don't ever want to take any kind of alcohol or disinfectant and try to clean that needle between animals with that, because you can actually reduce the efficacy of the vaccine. So in most situations, as long as that needle's not getting dirty, we're going to use the same needle without doing anything to it from animal to animal. If you're worried about certain disease pathogens, then that may be where you want to change that needle. But definitely don't use any kind of alcohol or anything to try to clean a needle between animals. And we're talking about the injectable needle here, not the metal transfer needle. The metal transfer needle, I'm going to clean it at the end of the day with my boiling distilled water. The other thing is that metal transfer needle, if for some reason you had more than one type of vaccine you had to mix together, I want a different needle for each one of those vaccines. So I may mix 10 bottles of vaccine together that's designed to be mixed together with that same transfer needle throughout the day. And what I do between times is I'll just leave it in the bottle. So when we're mixing vaccine, so let's say we were using a product like Shield, which is a modified live vaccine that we have to mix. It's going to have a glass bottle and a plastic bottle. I'm going to take the transfer needle and put it in the plastic bottle, turn it upside down, put the other end of the transfer needle in the glass bottle. The glass bottle will have a vacuum in it. All right. That vacuum will pull my liquid across. I'll pull the needle and the plastic bottle off and gently swirl that vaccine around. After I pull that vaccine up in my syringe and that glass bottle is empty, I'll take and stick that transfer needle back in it. So when I'm not using the transfer needle, on one end, it's going to have the glass bottle. On the other end, it's going to have the plastic bottle. That just keeps my transfer needle clean as I'm working cattle throughout the day. And then I can pull it apart when I get ready to mix that next round of vaccine. So that's how I would keep that transfer needle clean while I'm working cattle. At the end of the day, I'm going to clean it in the boiling water. The needle that we're actually giving the injection with, we're not going to clean it between animals. If we're worried about that, we're going to change that needle between animals. So hopefully that answers that question. So one of the questions that came in is if I'm using this multiple dose syringe, and so let's say I'm given a 5 cc Clostridial vaccine in that 50 cc barrel, it can hold 10 doses. Do I need to make sure I change that needle before I go back into the bottle to refill it? Absolutely. I never want to go back into the bottle with a dirty needle. So I'm going to change that needle before I go back into that bottle to draw up the next dose. As far as the animal goes, I may use that same needle on multiple animals as long as the needle hasn't gotten dull or dirty or bent in that situation. So yeah, don't ever go back into the bottle with the dirty needle. All right, well, I'll hang on for a little while here in case somebody is typing or thinking about that question. If you don't, feel free to go ahead and log off and have a good evening.